We've had some amazing JRPGs in the modern era of gaming, but unfortunately a bunch of stinkers as well. And I would know because I've played a lot of them. So in this video, I'll be sharing the 15 worst modern JRPGs you should never play, starting with Various Daylife. Now, I'm not really sure what Square was thinking with this one. It really should have just stayed a mobile title. The story has you arriving as a settler on a newly discovered continent, tasked with pulling your weight and helping tame the frontier. On paper, that sounds charming, but in practice, there's barely an overarching narrative here, and the one thread that does exist about your party unlocking warp points never even resolves by the time credits roll. The gameplay is really where it falls apart though. Your jobs aren't even activities you perform. They're a single button press on a menu that spits out a result. Adventures are side-scrolling auto walks where you watch a bar fill up until an encounter starts, and the combat is so hands-off it literally marks the best moves for you. It's a grind for money to raise stats so you can grind more, and it's wildly unbalanced from start to finish. The art and music, however, are genuinely good, and you can tell that talented people worked on the game, but no amount of pretty presentation hides the fact that this started life as a mobile game built for 2-minute sessions, and it plays exactly like one. Oh boy, El Rintaro's Wanderings. Talk about another slog. You would expect more from the creators of Rune Factory, but I'm not sure what happened here. You wake up in a cozy little town with amnesia, get welcomed by the locals, and start diving into dungeons that appear around the village. After each big boss, you wake up again in an ordinary high school in what might be the quote-unquote real world. The dual world idea has potential, but there's no real depth to the 10 partner characters you bond with, and the school side is so thin it barely counts. The whole game is a loot-based dungeon crawler where your level is tied to your gear, and the loop gets repetitive fast because the dungeon layouts don't actually change between difficulty tiers. But the side objectives are the real killer. A townsperson asks you to find their lost basket, and what that actually means is clear the dungeon without getting hit by a spike trap. There's no connective tissue at all. The art style has some charm and the monsters are clean and readable, but the town is lifeless with NPCs that don't move, the combat is 3 buttons, and the whole thing feels closer to an alpha build than a finished game. In the Princess Guide, you play as a veteran warrior tasked with training 4 princesses in the way of combat, using a praise and scold system to shape them. The premise is the best thing about it, and unfortunately the game does almost nothing with it. The princesses have distinct personalities but stay shallow, and the plot threads are so loosely connected that they're basically forgotten by the end. And the combat is a mess of 2 different command modes, a praise and scold mechanic, and the game does a terrible job of explaining any of it, which is ironic for a game all about teaching. Once you finally understand it, it collapses into pushing the same buttons on the same recycled battle arenas over and over and over again. Worse, you lose your units after each campaign, so leveling them barely matters. The art is bright and the localization is pretty funny in places, which covers up the weak story for a little bit. But it looks and runs like a low-budget title, and the whole thing is far more complicated than it has any right to be, while offering far less than it should. Now for Slime Isekai Chronicles, I actually earned the platinum for this game, if you can believe it, and I'm still not totally sure why. The story retells the anime arcs through visual novel style cutscenes and literal screenshots from the show, and if you've seen the anime, you're getting almost nothing new here. I find this style of storytelling pretty bland, and it was really hard to get invested into the game. Where it actually shines though is in the 2.5D side view action combat. It plays like a classic Tales game, it's fast and fluid, and stringing together combos across a big roster of characters is actually really fun. Easily the highlight of the game. The problem is that the game is about as shallow as a puddle. Outside of combat, there's only town building, and that's pointingly simple. There's no world map, no towns to explore. You just get a quest, hit a dungeon, come back, upgrade, and repeat. That's literally all the game has to offer. I actually wish the building was harder because you get showered with so many materials that you can build basically whatever you want at any time. It kind of felt pointless. And the chibi models aren't exactly my kind of style, and the environments are basic and repetitive, and I couldn't even hum a single track to you. There's a good combat system trapped inside an incredibly shallow game here. Goblin Slayer, Another Adventure Nightmare Feast is a spin-off where you play as a guild master running an adventurer's guild, and the strange part is Goblin Slayer himself barely shows up until several chapters in, and he can't even have his own equipment changed. Kind of odd for a game called Goblin Slayer. It's roughly half tactics game and half visual novel, with huge chunks of story between fights, and that story leans hard into edgy, grim, and occasionally genuinely uncomfortable territory. But that probably shouldn't come as a surprise if you've watched the anime. As a tactics game, it's the most by-the-numbers experience imaginable. Grid-based movement, swords, spells, and almost nothing that surprises you if you've ever touched a tactical RPG before. It even skips basic staples like counterattack, and the interface is an absolute chore to navigate, especially trying to check enemy range, which you can't even do while moving your own unit. And throughout the game, you'll recruit so many nameless generic units that it becomes a mess to try to manage with no way to filter them. That said, the character art is nice and the voice acting is pretty solid, but the sprites don't blend with the maps at all, and the interface looks like a spreadsheet. The whole thing feels like a budget release from 20 years ago sold at a modern price. It just can't hang with tactics greats that it's clearly trying to chase. Fantasy Hero Unsigned Legacy is the lowest rated JRPG for Nintendo Switch, and it's easy to see why. Humanity has been driven away into hiding by an alien force, and a discovered artifact grants a handful of heroes the power to fight back. Now, what's weird in a game like this is there's more dialogue than you'd expect, but the characters lack personality, and the story is generic filler that exists purely to shuffle you from one mission to the next, to the point where it's nearly impossible to follow. Now, the gameplay is kind of a mix between a top-down Diablo-like or a Monster Hunter game, except it doesn't do either particularly well. It leans heavily on grinding that leads nowhere, and combat feels really cheap. But the real sin of this game is the total lack of checkpoints. If you die 20 minutes into a mission, you get booted all the way back to town and you have to start all over again. And you can't even really pause the game, so going through the menu mid-fight leaves you totally defenseless. And enemies are relentlessly aggressive and chase you across the whole map, turning deaths into pure frustration. And it has this chibi art style that I'm not a big fan of, but there is some interesting customization buried under all the mess. Now, it was considered average when it arrived on the Vita, but by modern standards, it's a bare-bone, frustrating relic. I wanted to like Matto Anomalies more than I did, but sadly it's just not a very good game. You follow two protagonists, a detective and his exorcist partner, in a neon cyberpunk city investigating rifts full of demons. Sounds awesome, right? The setting and cast start strong, and the story has some real hooks early on. Unfortunately, the plot implodes towards the end, leaning on fake-out endings and reveals that cheapen everything built up before it. This is a game that tries to be a turn-based RPG, a detective visual novel, and a deck-building card game all at once, and it never ends up doing any of those well. The turn-based combat is the weakest part. It has a couple of neat ideas like a shared party health pool, but it gets dull and repetitive pretty fast thanks to a lack of enemy variety. And the mind hacking game with the cards are a low point, underexplained and looking like a 90s screensaver, and they frequently drag your progression to a screeching halt. Now, the art style is stylish and genuinely a highlight of the game, but the dungeons are barren, repetitive corridors, the city is lifeless with generic NPCs, and the non-stop repeated one-liners in combat will grate on your last nerve. Oh man, Loop 8. Not only is it an awful game, but easily one of my most disappointing games I've ever played because it had such promise. The premise is fantastic. You're a teen in an 80s Japanese town who could reset time whenever you fail to stop a demonic invasion, looping the same month of August until you win. And visually, the game is stunning. I love the look of this idyllic seaside town, and all the characters in the game are fantastic. The problem is with the execution. None of what the game is trying to do works at all. And also, a roguelike dating sim is just a terrible idea. The fatal flaw is with the loop itself. Essentially what happens is you're tasked with rescuing a character before they're gone forever, but the game does not explain well at all how to do this. So you're just mindlessly running around town, talking to people, trying to figure out how to save them until you inevitably fail and restart everything from the beginning. Each loop can take you 8 to 10 hours, and you're forced to slog through the exact same conversations and cutscenes you've seen again and again. And maybe you've seen combat in the trailers, but it's barely there. You only control one character while AI runs the rest of your party, and they often make baffling decisions instead of actually doing what you think would be the smart thing to do. And the dungeons are just the town itself with a color filter slapped over it. It's one of the most repetitive, mind-numbing experiences you can put yourself through, and no amount of atmosphere and pretty visuals can save it. I'm genuinely surprised Square would let such a mediocre Dragon Quest game, especially one with a story this revered in Japan, release like this. They definitely rushed out Affinity Strash to coincide with the release of the new anime instead of really polishing it. It adapts a beloved anime, and it does so in the worst way possible. Roughly half the runtime is a static image slideshow with a voiceover, some of which run up to 10 minutes straight. And if you know the source material, there's nothing new here. And if you don't, this is probably the worst way to experience it. The beginning is rushed so badly that the central emotional hooks barely register. The combat here is simple action hack and slash instead of typically turn-based that Dragon Quest is known for, and while it looks flashy, it feels completely hollow. Attacks land with no sense of impact, and it gets repetitive within the first few missions. And the structure of the game is baffling. You move between tiny map nodes, most of them just cutscenes, and the boss fights are often one-on-one bouts that undercut all the work you put into leveling your party. And then there's this roguelike temple mode bolted on that becomes a bit of a highlight only because it's a break from the endless slideshows. Visually, the game actually looks really good with nice character models, and the rare in-engine cutscenes are very well done, which makes the whole game even more frustrating. In the end, this turns out to be a lifeless husk of a game that's genuinely one of the worst ways to experience an otherwise great story. I was probably a few hours away from finishing Arc of Alchemist, but I just couldn't stand any of it anymore and I had to stop. At the beginning, the story throws you into the deep end with a party that you don't know, chasing a vague great power across a desert, and it never really bothers to explain much of anything. But right away, the biggest issue is the controls. They are so ridiculously delayed that it borders on unplayable. And controls are one of the hardest things to convey in a video, but trust me, everything you do is on delay. Not to mention, it's pretty buggy. I had characters T-posing and stuttering next to me instead of walking several times. Beyond that, the world is a set of small, empty areas where you just run from one mission marker to the next. And the combat is pretty shallow. Not to mention the game is this weird combination of being simultaneously too hard and too easy. Sometimes I would just one-shot enemies, and other times I'm getting one-shot by enemies several levels below me. It just never made sense. The game has this really odd leveling system where you dump points into skill attributes, and it's really hard to tell what's helping you the most. And after a short while, you've genuinely seen everything the game has to offer, and it just becomes repetitive after that. But I will give the game this: the menus and text boxes have a nice little aesthetic touch to them. But that's about the nicest thing I can say about this game. I remember warning everyone about Ray Natus before it released, but no one wanted to listen, and look what happened. The hype around this game was so high because Final Fantasy VII's writer wrote it, and it had a collab with The World Ends With You, and really reminded people of the ill-fated Final Fantasy Versus 13, but it just wasn't very good. You follow two leads in modern Shibuya where magic is outlawed and wizards are oppressed, one seeking liberation and one enforcing order. It's genuinely a good premise, and that's the sad thing about FuRyu's games. They always look cool and have interesting ideas, but they end up being really disappointing. And splitting the story across two protagonists splits the focus, and the narrative wanders and goes nowhere. Genuinely some of the worst writing you'll ever see in a game. One bright spot, however, is the combat, built around swapping between a suppressed defense mode and a liberated offensive mode in real time. It has a genuine spark to it that's pretty fun. Sadly, it's also simplistic and repetitive. A button masher without the mechanical depth it clearly wants to have. It's also held back further by systematic glitches and awkward design choices, and the performance is rough, even on systems that should be able to run it smoothly. Not to mention, this is a pretty ugly game. The gorgeous character art and cutscenes clash hard against dull, low-budget in-game models and environments that look like a full console generation behind. There's some charm buried in here for the most forgiving action fans, but the execution is lacking in nearly every department, and it constantly reminds you of far better games you'd wish you were playing instead. I've played a handful of Neptunia games, and Sisters vs. Sisters might genuinely be the worst one I've played. You play as the younger sister of the main cast, exploring a game shop and finding a mysterious goddess trapped in a capsule. The story segments are actually the best part of the game, with cute designs and voice actors who are clearly having a blast. If you're a fan of the series, you'll probably enjoy the extra time with these characters, but I've always felt the franchise works better as an anime, and playing it here made that feel truer than ever. Now for the gameplay, I don't know if I can properly articulate just how bad it feels to control. It's an action combat system and everything feels stiff and delayed. Attacks take what feel like half a second to register. Even walking around feels wrong. The camera has this weird momentum to it and it won't stop when you want it to, and jumping feels off too. It's easily one of the worst controlling games I've played in the modern era. On the presentation side, I played on PlayStation 5 and it just doesn't look or run well. The lighting looks blown out and overexposed, and there's this strange haze over everything, and it runs at a shaky 30 frames per second on hardware that has no excuse for that. The character designs are cute and the voice acting is good, but that is nowhere near enough to save this game. After a pair of good Star Ocean games, people have been having revisionist history with integrity and faithlessness, but I'm sorry, it's just genuinely a bad game. The story is about first contact with alien life, but it's bloated and empty, with underdeveloped characters and no emotional payoff, with one particular character being nothing but obvious gooner bait. And it's genuinely bad at explaining itself. Major plot points get glossed over, characters mindlessly trust strangers from another planet, and the villain is basically whoever happens to be standing there at the time. The cutscenes play out as walk and talk sequences where you can wander around while people talk, with subtitles on that you don't even get a name for who's talking. Optional character scenes are tucked behind a tedious ritual of running in and out of inns to respawn them. It's so frustrating. Now the combat and upgrade systems are pretty fun and there is a strong soundtrack. There are, however, these incredibly frustrating sequences sequences where you need to defend characters doing things on computers. Your entire team are brain dead idiots and you fail these pretty easily. I rage quit these sequences more than once, and they're easily the worst part of the game. It's further dragged down by a beautiful yet completely barren world that forces you to backtrack across the same empty areas over and over. And the camera can also be a little nauseating as it bounces up and down whenever you're running through environments. It's basically a microcosm of everything wrong with modern JRPGs. One of the most frustrating and baffling design games I've ever played is Natural Doctrine. The story is complete nonsense, and I'm not even totally sure what it was about. Something about mercenaries seeking citizenship, but it strings together a ridiculous chain of events. It starts with a teammate getting eaten, an ogre village that turns out to be a trap that was actually a test, and suddenly everyone's friends at the end. None of it makes sense. As far as the gameplay goes, it's a strategy RPG with one of the most convoluted and over-designed battle systems I've ever tried to figure out. It confuses the player so badly at every turn that you're constantly feeling like you're doing it wrong. I mean, just look at this combat setup. What the heck is even going on? And then I hit a wall, and that's where I had to quit the game. There's a battle where 9 enemies pop out at once against just 3 of mine, most of the enemies having ranged attacks, and they combo off each other and defeat one of my characters before I can even get a turn at times. But here's the kicker: if a single one of your characters die, the battle's over and you have to start over again. I tried this particular battle about 10 times and had to just give up. And the presentation is pretty rough as well. This looks like a last generation game running on new hardware, and the interface is a genuine anxiety attack, cluttered with dialogue, scrolling news tickers, and information crammed everywhere. Unless you're the most hardcore and masochistic strategy RPG fan, stay far away from this one. Oh, and I saved the best for last. Easily the worst modern JRPG I've ever played is Akiba's Trip Hellbound and Debriefed. I only gave this one a few hours before I had to tap out, and that was already too much. It's a remaster of the very first game in the series that originally released on the PSP, and the setup has you fighting vampires in Akihabara by stripping their clothes off to expose them to sunlight. No, really, that's how you fight in the game. The story quests are so poorly communicated, I once spent 30 minutes running around like an idiot trying to strip guards for an outfit that I could have just bought at a shop, and the game never tells you this. And the combat itself is a huge problem. It's clunky, awkward, and there's no lock-on, so the second more than one enemy shows up, it becomes a nightmare to deal with. Not to mention one of the most awkward jump animations I've ever seen in a video game. Then there are mechanics that made me genuinely uncomfortable, like being walked through a quote-unquote specific maneuver required to strip a character in a high school uniform. At that point, I was done. Visually, it's rough, and I'm not exaggerating when I say it has some of the worst textures I've ever seen in a video game. It's ugly, clunky, cringe-inducing, and borderline incriminating to have on your screen. Simply put, never play this game. Now, these were the worst modern JRPGs you should never play, but to see the best modern JRPGs you absolutely should play, watch this video next.